Hello, my name is Kathy Lee. I'm an extension educator with Michigan State University. Welcome to this educational video offered through DairyXnet, which is a national e-extension resource. The title of this video is Optimizing Production by Managing How Dairy Cows Eat. It will be presented by Dr. Trevor DeVries from the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. In this dairy video, you can learn about the role that feeding behavior has on ensuring dairy cow health and productivity. Dr. DeVries will discuss using the knowledge about cow eating behavior to evaluate feeding systems, including the management of feed and the feeding area. Strategies may then be implemented that allow cattle to have good access to the feed provided to them and consume it in a manner which is conducive to good health, productivity, and welfare. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to mention that there are many educational resources available through DairyXnet. A number of archived webinars are posted on the website. You can follow DairyXnet on Facebook and Twitter to get updates on educational videos, new articles posted to the website, and other dairy information. You can also sign up for the DairyXnet newsletter. Let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Trevor DeVries is a Canada Research Chair in Dairy Cattle Behavior and Welfare and an Associate Professor in the Department of Animal Biosciences at the University of Guelph. Dr. DeVries received his Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University of British Columbia in 2001. Immediately following, he began graduate studies also at the University of British Columbia. After receiving his PhD in 2006, he worked for 1 year as a postdoctoral researcher at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. In 2007, Dr. DeVries was appointed as faculty with the University of Guelph. In his current position, Trevor is involved in research and teaching in the areas of dairy cattle nutrition, management, behavior, and welfare. Trevor, at this time, I turn over the program to you, and we look forward to learning about how to manage what dairy cows eat to optimize production.
Thank you very much for the introduction. As introduced, my name is Trevor DeVries from the University of Guelph, and today we're going to be talking about optimizing production by managing how dairy cows eat. When we think of the nutritional management of dairy cows, we can think of it from a number of different perspectives. We can think of it from a dietary formulation standpoint, that is taking information about the feeds that we have, about our production targets, about the requirements that the animals have, and putting that together to come up with what is on paper the optimal ration for meeting those targets. The next step would be to actually put that ration on paper into a mix. So a lot of information and processes needs to go into putting together that proper ration. And then say we get that all right, then the last thing that we need to consider is how that feed actually gets managed for the cows and by the cows. And specifically, we need to think about what the cows actually do with the feed. And that's really the focus of my presentation today, is to think about how dairy cows consume their feed and the impact that that has on ensuring that cows get the optimal value from that feed that's put in front of them. And the three things that we need to consider from an eating behavior standpoint in the cow is whether or not she eats the amount required to meet those production targets, to whether or not she eats the feed in a healthy manner, which is going to keep her rumen healthy and stable, and then also whether or not she eats that feed as it's actually put in front of her, so that she's actually consuming the balance of nutrients which she requires. So the first thing I want to touch on is the fact that when we think about dairy cows as a production animal, thinking about the drivers of milk production in cows, we know that milk production is really driven by dry matter intake. And if we're going to stimulate and optimize dry matter intake, we need to think about how do we get cows to eat more feed. And it might sound quite simple, but if we need cows to consume more feed, they actually need to change some aspect of their eating behavior. And that is shown very well in the schematic here on this slide, where we see that the amount of dry matter consumed by the cow is really a function of how she actually consumes her feed. So her, for example, her meal frequency as well as her meal size, the product of those two things, so the number of meals per day as well as the size of those meals, would equal her dry matter intake. And similarly, the amount of time, so the feeding time of the cow multiplied by the rate of feed consumption, would equal the amount of feed consumed. So if we're going to ask a cow to eat more, we need to get that cow to change some aspect of her eating behavior. So she either needs to have more meals per day, larger meals, or some combination of those two factors, or spend more time eating, or eat faster, or again, some combination of those two factors. Which of those is most important in terms of driving dry matter intake is another question that we need to answer, and something that we've quite recently looked at in some of our research. And one of the things that we've done is taken data from a whole number of studies where we've had individual dry matter intakes from cows, as well as different aspects of their feeding behavior, and looked at which aspects of feeding behavior were most consistently associated with dry matter intake. And what we found is that dry matter intake is most consistently associated with the amount of time that cows spend eating their feed, as well as the frequency of meals that cows have per day. And you can see an example of that in the figure on the screen, where we see feeding time correlated with dry matter intake, where you see a positive relationship. Now, it's not very steep, but you see that as feeding time increases, we also see dry matter intake level of cows increasing. And we see the same relationship with meal frequency, so whereby those cows that are having the highest level of dry matter intake are also the ones having the most frequent meals per day. So from an intake standpoint, we need to consider those factors which are going to stimulate cows to spend more time eating and distribute that eating time in more frequent, smaller meals across the day. Not only is it beneficial to have cows spend more time eating across the day in smaller meals from an intake standpoint, but we also know that it's important from a rumen health standpoint. In fact, we know that if cows distribute their meals more consistently across the day, having some more meals, what we end up is a much more consistent rumen fermentation pattern, where we avoid very large individual meals, which are going to cause depressions in rumen pH, but create a much more consistent rumen environment, which is going to be more conducive to an improved fermentation pattern associated with things like improved milk fat. And we see an example of that here on the screen, where cows that are having more frequent meals per day are also the ones that then also have milk with higher milk fat content. And the association there is that these cows with more frequent, smaller meals are having a more stable rumen environment, which is then conducive to greater milk fat. If we put that together with the impact that that has on dry matter intake, those cows then that have more frequent meals per day are also then going to be the ones that not only have a more stable rumen environment, but are also eating more, and thus more likely to be our highest producing cows as well. And again, we see this positive relationship here, where we can see that those cows that are consuming the most frequent meals across the day, smaller meals more frequently, are also going to be our highest producing cows across the day as well. It's also to note that it's not only important how cows distribute their eating time across the day, but what those cows actually consume. And so we know that we have a lot of good intentions when we provide a mixed ration to dairy cows, a TMR, where we're trying to target a set level of nutrient intake by providing them this well-balanced, well-mixed diet of different feed components. However, we know that even though we have that intention, cows don't always eat that feed as we think they're going to consume that feed. And you can see the picture of the cow here on the screen trying to lick up one little bit of feed. And if we watch cows long enough, you'll see them, no matter how well mixed a TMR is, they're going to try consume the parts of that TMR that they like to consume. They sort that diet. And what sorting does is really ends up resulting in cows consuming a diet that's imbalanced relative to what they require. And thus it's not surprising then that cows aren't always able to make their predicted production outcomes based on the diets that we provide to them if they're not consuming it as intended. We have some good evidence of that in a number of studies that we've conducted over the years. And on the screen here is one recent study where we looked at how much sorting cows do and how that relates to the production of individual milk components. And so what you see on the upper left-hand side of the screen is an association of milk fat in dairy cows with the amount of sorting that occurs of long ration particles. So these are the particles as seen on the bottom left side of the screen, the top screen of a Penn State shaker box. And basically 100% on this scale here would equal the cows consuming exactly the amount we predicted them to have consumed based on what was provided to them, where anything under 100% would indicate selective refusal or sorting against those long particles. And what you see here is this negative relationship looking from, in this case, right to left, where those cows that have the lowest milk fat are also the ones that are doing the most sorting against those long ration particles. And again, that shouldn't surprise us too much in that those cows that are sorting against long ration particles are selecting against fiber, which again is going to increase the risk of low rumen pH subacute ruminal acidosis, which we know is a risk factor for low milk fat. What's interesting about this data set is we didn't only find this association with milk fat, but we also found it with milk protein. So on the bottom right-hand side, you see quite a similar association where those cows that, again, are doing the most sorting against the long particles of the ration are also the ones that have lowest milk protein content. And so what that tells us is that those cows that are, again, doing a lot of sorting are the ones that aren't consuming a diet that's balanced to meet their needs. In particular, maybe not consuming the balance of amino acids that they require to, say, optimize microbial protein production and in the end, the production of milk protein. So again, significant impacts just based on how cows sort their diet in terms of what actually they produce. And we don't only see those impacts of sorting at an individual cow level, but we also see them at a herd level. And so what I have on the screen is some data from a study we did of dairy herds in Canada from a few years back, where we looked at sorting at a group level. And again, we looked at the refusal of long particles, so those particles that sit on the top screen of a shaker box. And what we saw was that every 2% refusal of those long particles was associated with about 0.9 kilograms or 2 pounds of fat-corrected milk. And a decrease also in production efficiency. So cows not only not able to achieve production targets, but also producing that milk less efficiently because they're not consuming their diet as intended for them. In this study, we actually saw at a herd level refusal anywhere from 0, so herds with very little sorting, to up to about 10% refusal of those long particles. And so what that translated into was us being able to predict almost 4.5 kilos, or let's say about 10 pounds of difference in milk production between herds, simply based on the amount of sorting that was occurring at a herd level. So using that information about how dairy cows eat their feed and what they actually consume, and the importance that has in terms of ensuring sufficient dry matter intake, keeping rumens healthy, and making sure cows actually consume the nutrients that we expect them to consume, We need to then think about what this means from a feeding management standpoint. How do we then use that information to manage the feed of dairy cows so that they're going to optimize that behavior and really optimize the value of the ration that we provide to them? And really, I have 2 points that we need to think about. First, ensuring that dairy cows are stimulated to access their feed throughout the day and ensuring that happens. And then secondly, making sure that they have access to that ration formulated for them throughout the day, meaning that they, when they go to feed, that feed as it's intended is there and available to them, and they're able to gain access to that. And so what I want to do is walk you through why these 2 points are in particular important for dairy cows. So the first question we have is, how do we actually stimulate cows to access their feed throughout the day? And if we would have asked this question 50 years ago, thinking about cows managed in an extensive situation on pasture, we would typically think about the factors that drive dairy cows to consume their feed at different times of the day. And largely our thoughts would allude to the idea that eating patterns in dairy cows would be dictated by the time of day. And that belief that cows' eating patterns are dictated by time of day, particularly with large, extensive eating bouts in the morning and late afternoon, has long been held. However, we know from recent research by our group as well as others that when we keep cows in more intensive situations, fed mixed rations like total mixed rations inside, we know that their eating patterns are not only dictated by time of day, but even more so dictated by management events that occur throughout the day. And what our research has actually shown is that probably the single greatest driver of the eating patterns of cows that are kept in barns and fed total mixed rations is going to be the delivery of new feed. And that impact of that delivery feed has a much more greater impact on stimulating feeding activity than any other management event or time of day, regardless of the time of day that we even provide that feed to those cows. So with that knowledge, we then can think about, okay, how do we actually manipulate the feeding activity patterns of cows? One of the things that we've shown in our research quite consistently is that one of the easiest ways to stimulate cows to access their feed throughout the day is actually to deliver feed more often. And so we've conducted a series of studies where we looked at this, and what we found is that when we move away from delivering TMR once a day, going up to twice a day or more often from that, what we see is cows spreading out their feed consumption more consistently across the day, spending more time at the bunk, slowing down their rate of intake, and having more frequent, smaller meals. And a good example of that is seen here in the bottom left-hand corner, where this is a comparison in a study we did where we're looking at twice-a-day feed delivery. In the blue line where we see the percentage of cows at the feed bunk across the day, and in the green line you see cows that were fed 4 times per day. What you see in this situation is that the cows fed 4 times a day have 2 extra peaks of feeding activity occurring in the middle of the day as well as in the middle of the night. And what those correspond to is those cows actually distributing their feed consumption more evenly across the day, slowing down their rate of intake and having more frequent meals. The other thing that we've discovered in our research on feed delivery frequency is that the more often we provide feed to cows, the less opportunity they actually have to sort that feed on an individual feed delivery basis. And so what you see here in this graph is actually how the fiber or NDF content of the feed changes across the day, in this case whether cows are fed once a day or twice a day. And it doesn't look too much different until you get to the later part of the day where you see the separation in these lines. And what that indicates is that these cows that are fed once per day, their feed available to the cows is changing in terms of the amount of fiber that's left at the bunk, representing cows sorting against that fiber, is increasing at a greater rate. And what we've seen in this research, as well as other projects by our group as well as other groups, is that if we feed cows more often once per day, what we see is that cows have less time to access individual piles of feed, resulting in less sorting of those individual piles, resulting in a more consistent intake of nutrients across the day relative to what we expect those cows to consume based on what diet is actually formulated for those cows. What this all translates into for the cow from a benefit standpoint is a more consistent intake of nutrients into the rumen, not only within time but also across time. And probably one of the most consistently reported benefits of such consistency in terms of what the cows actually consume is things related to improvements in the rumen environment. So much more stable rumen pH, improved fiber digestibility, improve feed efficiency, and probably one of the most consistently reported benefits has been improved milk fat percentage. And what you have here on the screen is one example of that. This is data from Penn State University where they looked at feeding cows 1 time per day or up to 4 times per day. And what you see here is that cows that were milked actually 4 times per day, what we see is that we see out of 3 out of the 4 milking times, we see significant increases in milk fat percentage, where cows' milk fat is increasing by anywhere from 0.22 to 0.45 percentage points across those milkings just by feeding those cows more often. So by getting those cows to eat more consistently, promoting more consistent rumen environment, we're seeing that dramatic of an increase in terms of improvements in milk fat in those cows. Now, one of the less consistent responses by feeding cows more often is actually getting cows to eat more. Now, intuitively, one might think that if we feed cows more often, they're going to eat more. Sometimes that happens, sometimes that does not. Most of the consistent response, as I just described, has to do with keeping that rumen environment more stable. We have, however, seen in some projects increases in feed consumption. And there's one example here on the screen for you at this time, where we fed cows in this study either once a day, twice a day, or 3 times per day. And for cows that were milked actually 3 times per day. And so what we did is we layered on the feed deliveries to the times of milking. So either feeding cows at this milking time here once a day. For twice a day, we fed them also at this milking here. And then for 3 times a day, we also fed them for the final milking of the day, as represented by the last peak there. And what we saw is that as we added more feed deliveries, we actually saw an improvement in dry matter intake, particularly at 3x feeding per day. But one of the things that you'll notice is that even though we added on feed deliveries to those individual time points, all we did was created a larger meal for the cows at those individual time points. So even though we got greater dry matter intake, we weren't actually benefiting the feeding patterns of the cows. We're actually just causing the cows to consume larger meals, which would not be as beneficial from a rumen health standpoint as getting them to eat more consistently across the day. So this got us thinking, what then is optimal for the cow in terms of trying to stimulate that eating activity? Can we take advantage of different management events that occur across the day and try to stimulate more eating activity by actually separating those management events? So we actually did that in a follow-up study, which you see here on the screen, where we took the time of feed delivery and we moved it away from milking time. So in this case, as represented by the black arrows on the bottom, we had cows milked again 3 times per day. And we either fed the cows at the milking time, at 2 of the milking times per day. So as represented by the gray line, we had the cows fed and milked at 1400 hours or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as well as 7 o'clock the next morning. In our alternative treatment, we actually moved that time of feed delivery away from those 2 milking times. So we pushed that time of feed delivery 3.5 hours later. So at around 5:30 in the afternoon or at 10:30 in the following morning. What you can see by looking at the distribution of dry matter intake across the day is we see a little bit more of a leveling effect of doing that, where Suddenly our largest meals are now following feed delivery and not milking, again suggesting that it's that feed delivery which is having the biggest impact in terms of stimulating intake and driving those intake patterns. But what we see is that cows actually spend a little bit more time eating. They slow down their rate of intake and actually consume one more meal per day across the day. And what we saw as a result of that is that cows actually improve their efficiency of feed conversion by about 7% by actually distributing their intake pattern more consistently across the day. The question for dairy producers then becomes is how do we actually operationalize this farm from a labor standpoint, from a fuel standpoint, does it make sense? And that's a question that needs to be answered on individual farms. But one of the opportunities that we have here nowadays is the opportunity to automate these processes. And so we actually have a number of different automated TMR mixing and delivery systems available to us. And what those systems are providing for us is not only that opportunity to provide feed more frequently, but also reduce some of the inconsistencies that we have in feeding management and feed delivery to our cows. And again, that inconsistency can be problematic from a cow production standpoint as well. And the point I want to make is that automation can also take away human inconsistency in terms of feed mixing and feed delivery. And we have some really interesting data from a study from a couple years ago where we looked at the consistency of feed delivery on commercial dairy farms across 7-day periods of time, where we looked at how when we sampled feed on farms that was delivered for 7 consecutive days, how much day-to-day variation there was in terms of what nutrients cows were receiving from those diets. What you have in the figure on the screen is an association on the bottom axis here, the x-axis, of the variation in net energy content of the diet. So the amount of energy content of those diets that were provided on those farms correlated with, on the y-axis on the left side here, the dry matter intake level. And what you see here is this negative relationship where the more variability there was on those farms day to day, we see less dry matter intake on average on those farms, where every, as you see on the slide here, every half point increase in that variability was associated by about 1.1 kilos or over 2 pounds difference in dry matter intake level per cow per day on those farms. So what this suggests is that even though we don't know cause and effect in this case, the more consistent those farms were in terms of what they were delivering from a feed standpoint, from a day-to-day perspective, the higher intake level in those cows. And if it takes automation for us to achieve that, that's a huge opportunity that we have on our farms to minimize some of that variation. Another point that I need to make when it comes to feeding management is that we don't only need to stimulate cows to eat across the day, but we also need to make sure that when cows are actually stimulated or when they want to go to the feed bunk, that there's feed present for that cow when they go there. And you can see that in the picture here on the screen, the cow standing there looking at the camera in this case is telling us something, that that cow wants to consume that feed that's pushed away and not within her reach. And if that cow comes to the bunk at this time and that feed is not pushed in for her at that time, she's going to make a decision. She's going to either spend time waiting around, standing, waiting for that feed to come back to her, or she might forego that eating opportunity and come back later. And in that case, you might have lost intake potential on that cow. And so our target is to make sure that we get that feed pushed back to those cows as frequently as possible across the day to ensure that we don't have situations across the day where we have that empty bunk where that cow can't access the feed that she wants to consume. Part of the response of the cows to that situation should be the fact that they shouldn't be actually stimulated to go run to the bunk when we actually push that feed up. Producers often say that when they push up feed, the cows come running to the bunk. And what that tells me in that situation is that those cows have been too long without feed in that case. And rather than stimulating intake, what push-up should really do is make sure that the feed is there when the cow wants to be there. A good example of this actually comes from a recent study where we actually looked at the association of feeding management and different measures of behavior on farms milking with robots here in Canada. And what we found was that there was this association of the number of times that we're pushing up feed per day and the amount of time cows are spending lying down. So on average, the farms that we were looking at were pushing up feed 8 times per day, and this ranged from anywhere from 2 to 24 times per day. What we found was that for every 2 extra feed push-ups per day across that range of 2 to 24 times, we saw about 0.1 hours of increased lying time per cow. So across that range of farms, that's about an hour difference between our lowest herd and our highest feed push-up frequency herds. And so what that tells me is that the more often we're pushing up feed, the more time cows are actually devoting to lying down because they're able to use their time more efficiently. They're not having to stand around, wait for access to their feed because it's not available to them, it's not pushed up, but rather they have that access when they want it, and then they can devote that extra time rather than to standing around, but to actually using that time efficiently and using that for lying down. And so again, I think we have an opportunity here in the dairy industry. If we can do this manually, again, whether that's by hand, whether that's through mechanical devices, skid steers, tractors, whatever else have you, with human input into that, that works as long as we're doing that often and we're doing that consistently. If that consistency is an issue on our farms, then we need to start considering what automated systems might be available. And again, we have a number of automated systems available to us for automating that feed push-up process on our farms. And if that, again, ensures that we don't have human inconsistency, we do it on a regular basis, we're making sure cows' feed is available to them at all times, that's the true benefit of automating those processes on our farms. One final point when it comes to feeding management is the fact that we want to minimize the amount of time that cows are without feed. Again, from a feeding management standpoint, we don't want a lot of feed leftovers at the end of the day. That can be difficult to handle. That can be a lot of extra feed that might be wasted. However, at the same time, we want to make sure that if we're going down to systems where we're having little to no refusal at the end of the day, we need to be very careful in terms of minimizing the amount of time that cows are without feed. Similar to feed push-ups, if we end up with a situation where cows are without feed for too long and we deliver new feed, what happens is we see this slug feeding response by the cows where they're going to run to the bunk, they're hungry, they're going to want to consume that feed, and they're going to do so in very large meals, which we know aren't as efficient for those cows. And so we want to avoid those situations by minimizing that amount of time that cows are without feed. And again, if we can manage that very well and keep that time to less than an hour per day where we've got an empty bunk, that can work quite well. But if we're see a lot of inconsistency in that, and we see a lot of variation in terms of how much time cows are without feed, that represents a problem, and that's something that we need to avoid on our farms. The final point from a feeding management standpoint that I want to make is that not only do we want to make sure that cows are stimulated to access their feed, they have access to that feed in terms of that feed's there for them, but the cows should physically be able to get to that feed when they want to. And the issue I'm going to describe is for our group house cows, we want to make sure that they have the space that's available to them to get to the bunk when they need to. And so thinking about stocking densities at the feed bunk, thinking about factors which might prevent them from getting to that feed. And if our stocking densities are not set so that cows can get to the feed bunk when they want to, there's enough space for all cows to eat at the same time, what happens is that we see cows changing their intake patterns to compensate for that. And so what we might see is that if cows can't get to the feed bunk when they want to, they might either change their pattern of intake where they're going to either eat faster in larger meals, or they might actually end up foregoing eating opportunities. And I think that's particularly a risk factor for those cows that are at most risk for depressions in dry matter intake, and the cows I'm thinking about particularly are transition cows. And so we have good data to suggest that when we introduce competition for feed access, if cows don't have good access to feed, particularly during that transition period, most actually important during the close-up period, so in the 2 weeks before calving, if we introduce competition for feed access during that time period, we really increase the risk of cows not optimizing their dry matter intake, not consuming enough nutrients, and the carryover impact on that into the fresh period can occur as well. And there's a number of studies that have shown that those impacts then of reduced intake and competition for feed access can spill over not only into reduced intake, reduced milk production potential, but also increased risk of other health complications, things like excessive negative energy balance and ketosis in early lactation if those cows can't consume enough nutrients because of that feed bunk competition during that time period. So we really need to focus for these vulnerable cows on ensuring they have enough space per cow at the feed bunk. And so providing a minimum of, say, 75 centimeters or 30 inches of bunk space for those cows during that time period is critical for ensuring that those cows can get to feed when they want to and can maximize their intake. For the remainder of our lactating dairy cows, what we found in research is that they're actually quite resilient when it comes to maintaining dry matter intake, even at fairly high levels of overstocking or crowding at the feed bunk. However, just because they can maintain dry matter intake in some situations, maybe not all, doesn't mean that overcrowding doesn't come without a price. And we actually see other impacts of crowding then appear for those cows that are, say, later in lactation. And a good example of that is a study we conducted a couple of years ago where we surveyed farms in Canada looking at the amount of feed bunk space that was available to cows and correlated that with production parameters. And quite interestingly, what we found was that we saw that farms that had greater bunk space, so across a range of about 14 inches of bunk space up to 30 inches of bunk space per cow, we saw that every 4-inch increase in bunk space across that range was associated with about 0.06 percentage points greater milk fat and about a 13% decrease in somatic cell count. And again, I think we can explain these differences based on the impact that competition at the feed bunk has on the individual feeding patterns of cows. If cows are forced to, again, compete for access to their feed, particularly at the times when they want to be eating, at those times when we deliver feed and all the cows go up to the bunk, what we see is cows changing their intake patterns. And as I mentioned before, you're going to see cows consuming their feed much quicker and in larger meals, which again may compromise that rumen environment and may explain why we see less milk fat with lower levels of bunk space. Similarly, if cows are forced to compete, you may end up with some cows who don't want to compete and then may end up changing their intake patterns where, say, rather than right after milking, say when feed is freshly delivered, rather than wanting to go to the feed bunk, they may choose to lie down. And that might not only be stressful to the cow, but at the same time, because they've just been milked, their teat canals are open, they might have a greater chance of being at risk for a bacterial infection of their udder at that time. So that might actually help explain this impact on somatic cell count in those cases as well. So that gets me to my take-home messages, and really one of the major points of my presentation today is to think about the impact that management of the feed bunk has on the eating patterns of cows, and the fact that those eating patterns and how we manage those eating patterns through feed bunk management can have just as much of an impact on cow health, efficiency, and production as the ration itself that we're providing to those cows. And from a practical standpoint then, what we need to think about is factors that allow cows to eat when they want and what they need. And so to really take advantage of the eating behavior of the cows, we need to think about things that are going to keep feed in front of cows, making sure that feed's always available, that feed is the feed that we intend those cows to receive, so it's not sorted, it's consistent with that which is formulated and delivered to those cows. We stimulate those cows to feed frequently throughout the day, and there's nothing hindering those cows from accessing that feed throughout the day as well. They have enough space and opportunity to get to that feed when they want to. With that, I thank you very much for your attention and hope that this information provided to you today has provided you with some good practical things to think about when it comes to feeding management of dairy cows.
Thank you to Dr. DeVries for sharing this practical information about dairy cow feeding management. We also thank our viewers for watching this video. We encourage you to check out the DairyXnet website for other educational videos and resources.